Good evening. It's good to be back and to see everybody again. As we said before, the first two lessons in this series are introductory, foundational to the things that we'll be talking about later in the week. And last evening, we looked at the fact that faith is based on evidence. Then secondly, that there are two sources of evidence, scientific evidence and historical evidence. So this lesson today has to do with the obligatory nature of evidence as advertised, and we're asking the question, what does it mean for me? Now, the existence of evidence obligates us in these two ways, and we'll be using these as our main points in the lesson tonight. First, obligation is to receive and examine the evidence properly, and then to react to it appropriately. As we mentioned yesterday evening, our theme verse comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things and hold fast that which is good. And it's so important that we test the evidence. Now, we're looking at evidence as though presented in a courtroom setting using the historical method. In a criminal case, the people responsible for considering the evidence are the jurors. And a person accused of crimes is given the right to a trial by jury, as granted by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution of Canada. And in criminal cases, there are 12 citizens chosen to decide the guilt or innocence of the accused. And so let's look at the jurors' obligation. Get this to work. And quoting from the Handbook for Trial Jurors Serving in the U.S. District Courts, which I'm from the United States, and we'll have some quotes from Canada as well. And the rules are the same for both countries. And in this document, it says the judge determines the law to be applied in the case while the jury decides the facts. The jury decides the facts. In that same publication, it says the jury must determine what the true facts are. That's their job. If they don't do that, they're not doing their job. And again, the jury takes an oath to decide the case upon the law and the evidence. In the preliminary instructions according to the Canadian Judicial Council, it says, quote, he or she, talking about the jurors, must decide the case solely on the basis of the evidence at trial. And so you don't consider anything else than what's presented there in the courtroom. You see the decisions that the jury has to make. They determine the facts and decide the case. Now, in this matter of evidence concerning God and the Bible and Jesus Christ, you are the jury. Of course, that presumes that you will examine the evidence fairly. All right, some more quotes about the juror's obligation, because they have to be of a certain character. Jurors must be men and women possessed of sound judgment, absolute honesty, and a complete sense of fairness. Now, if you were put on trial, would you want jurors there with those qualities? You would want a fair trial, obviously. And in the publication, it continues to decide cases correctly. Jurors must be honest and intelligent. They must have both integrity and good judgment. The jury system is based on these attributes. The continued vitality of the jury system depends on them. Of course, the jury system is important for a free society. It's to prevent corruption in the judicial system. Winston Churchill once said about the British and Canadian law systems, he said, the scrutiny of 12 honest jurors provides defendants and plaintiffs alike a safeguard from arbitrary perversion of the law. And so I think that is a very good statement, very true statement. If we didn't have fair trials, with the jurors sitting there making these judgments, we would be subject to abuse by those who are in power. Jurors should give close attention to testimony, according to the handout. They are sworn to disregard their prejudices. Each juror should keep an open mind. We understand that. That's necessary. When you look at any evidence, you've got to keep an open mind. Human experience shows that once persons come to a preliminary conclusion as to a set of facts, they hesitate to change their views. Therefore, it is wise for jurors to not even attempt to make up their mind on the facts of the case until all the evidence has been presented to them. So these are instructions given to prevent bias from entering the minds of the people who are listening. Don't decide on the case until you hear all the evidence. But yet, when you talk to people about God and the Bible and Jesus Christ, they come to the discussion with their biases. They've decided beforehand. Many times they've decided not even to listen to you. And so, if we're going to be fair in the trial system, we need to be fair when it comes to spiritual things and examine all that is there. When you consider a jury, they're composed of ordinary people. They're not experts in law. You don't have to be an expert in law to be sitting on the jury. They're just common people in the community who are expected to have enough reasoning and enough fairness to determine the facts and render a verdict. And so when they hear evidence in a courtroom, we ask, well, what type of evidence will they hear? If they're going to be good, honest, unbiased jurors, what are they going to be listening to? Well, there are two kinds of evidence within historical evidence. And the first kind is direct evidence, testimonial evidence. We talked a little bit about this yesterday evening. In a Black's Law Dictionary, testimonial evidence is defined in this way. A person's testimony offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, especially evidence solicited from a witness. And of course, we understand the value of witnesses in a trial. If you have somebody who saw a murder take place and they're put on the stand, they'll say, I saw the defendant stab the victim. And we quoted from Deuteronomy 17 yesterday, or at least referred to it. In the law of Moses, whoever is worthy of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witness shall be first against him to put him to death. So people then had to make these determinations. But you see how powerful eyewitness testimony is. It's so convincing, especially 2 or 3 witnesses, that truth is determined and guilt is established. So we need testimony from reliable eyewitnesses, and we understand they're reliable. The evidence is conclusive. But when you talk about criminal cases, the vast majority of them don't have eyewitnesses to the crime. When you consider a criminal case, maybe close to 98% of crimes don't have an eyewitness there, because if there was an eyewitness, you're pretty much done at that point. But we have to understand the strength of circumstantial evidence, or indirect evidence. And in a lot of, say, settings today, like TV shows and news, people have the wrong impression about circumstantial evidence. They think it's weak, but it's not. It's very strong and very convincing. And we use that all the time in making judgments about things. Let's say that we're a juror in a courtroom, and people come in and you notice that they're wet, and they have umbrellas with them that are wet. You can come to a reasonable conclusion. It's raining outside. And know that that's true, though you don't witness the rain for yourself. It's just an easy example of circumstantial evidence. But it can be very powerful. And the advantage to circumstantial evidence is you don't have an eyewitness or somebody claiming to be an eyewitness lying to you. You don't have to weigh that at all, because circumstantial evidence is very strong when you see it. And so you have to build a cumulative case. There's certain things that point to one conclusion. Let's give Black's definition here before I forget. Circumstantial evidence is evidence based on inference and not on personal knowledge or observation. All evidence that is not given by eyewitness testimony. So whatever evidence is not number 1, it is therefore number 2. All right, let's give an example, perhaps, of a thorough example of building a cumulative case based on circumstantial evidence. Let's say that in a courtroom setting we have a suspect, and this is what we find out. We find out that during the hour of the murder, the suspect cannot account for his whereabouts. He's lying about his alibi. No, that was very suspicious. But you don't have quite enough yet, because he may not have committed the murder, maybe covering up for someone. You need more than that. But that's very suspicious. You learn that only two people had keys to the victim's house, the victim and the suspect. And there's no sign of forced entry. That's something else to consider. You look at the scene and determine that there was a struggle before the person died. And the suspect has suspicious cuts and bruises on him that weren't seen by people the previous day. Well, based upon the scene, a very bloody scene, blood had to probably have gotten on the attacker. And then the suspect is found to have at his house a pair of jeans and a shirt that had a cleaning agent used on them. Get rid of stains. And you learn that the victim died of a head wound from a hard object, and the suspect has a baseball bat at his house that had bleach applied to it. Listen. See, we're building this up. Circumstantial case. This guy's a little nervous now, all this is brought out. Another circumstance, an orange Mercedes with a yellow stripe was seen in the area where the victim was murdered. And the suspect was the only one, in the province that has that model car with this special paint job. We could go on. We could stop right there and have a pretty good case. And somebody here says, I saw the victim leave, the defendant leave the victim's house. All right, that puts the attacker in the area at the time. And the defendant's DNA was found at the crime scene. And really, that's considered circumstantial evidence, their DNA. And then we learn also that the defendant had taken out life insurance on the victim. And you see, all the circumstances here point to the same reasonable conclusion. And you can know without anybody actually seeing the murder. You can know who did it. This is a reasonable conclusion. Somebody would say, well, you can't really know 100% whether that happened that way or not. But that's not the criteria for trial. It is instead beyond a reasonable doubt. So, reasonable doubt. And you see, common sense just tells you that's the guy who did it. And so you, as a juror, can say with a degree of confidence, guilty as charged. So circumstantial evidence is very strong. Very strong. And we'll be using both testimonial evidence and circumstantial evidence in regard to proving the fact that Jesus Christ and about the resurrection as well. We need to talk about the concept of evidential sufficiency. Black's Law Dictionary says that satisfactory evidence is that evidence that is sufficient to satisfy an unprejudiced mind seeking the truth. It's when a juror reaches that point and say, okay, I'm convinced. And I'm comfortable enough that I can say, indeed, he's guilty or he's innocent. Now, in my example that I gave a while ago, there were several things I gave you in circumstantial evidence. And probably you reached the conclusion the guy's guilty before I had to list all of those. And so you ask the question, when does evidence become sufficient toward belief? Does it take 3 pieces of evidence to convince you? 5? 10? 20? What does it take? When is enough enough? Well, juries come to conclusions every day this way. And different people sitting on the jury, there may be some who are convinced before maybe another person on the jury is. But they have to come to these conclusions, otherwise you can't convict anyone in the court of law. Let's give a couple of Bible examples of this. All right, let's go to our Bibles now and understand that different people need different evidence. Let's go to John chapter 1 and talk about Nathanael. Let's turn over there. Now, Nathanael was one of the early disciples. But before he was a disciple, Philip comes to him and says to him in John 1:45, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Are you kidding me? That little town over there? Anything good? And maybe Nathanael thought, you don't read in the Old Testament of prophets coming from that place. Why would the Messiah come there? And so he's very skeptical. And then Philip says to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite, indeed, in whom is no God." And so Jesus knows the character of Nathanael. And Nathanael was a person, apparently, who made it a point to be honest, not to be deceptive in what he does and what he says. So he's an Israelite indeed. That's a high compliment made to Nathanael. He wants to be a spiritual. And so Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" And so Nathanael doesn't disagree. He knows how self-conscious he is about God. So, how do you know me? And Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." It only took one piece of evidence, or maybe two, that no guile, and I knew who you were before. So Nathanael said, I believe that's enough. I'm convinced. And so when Nathanael was under the fig tree, perhaps he was all alone. Maybe he was praying to God. And so in regard to Nathanael, you have very easy belief that guy represents Nathanael. Now let's go to somebody else and see that they needed a lot more evidence to come to faith. Let's go to John chapter 11. To begin, to introduce this person, who is Thomas. John chapter 11 and verse 16. And in this case, this is before Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and so they determined they're going to go toward Jerusalem in that area. Of course, Jesus has been threatened there. It's not a place of safety. That's where his enemies are located. And Thomas, it says, who's called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go that we may die." Now, I don't think that Thomas is making a noble statement like, "Well, let's go, and if we have to die, then let's die." I think he's like the Eeyore of the apostles. Let us also go that we may die. I think he's like, okay, if he's going to go, then we're all going to die. Let's go ahead. I think that's where he's coming from there. All right, let's go to really what we want to get at, which is in John chapter 20. Just introducing his skeptical character. You see it especially in this passage. In John chapter 20, in verse 24, we read that when Jesus had appeared to the other apostles, Thomas wasn't there. Didn't get to see that resurrection appearance of Jesus. And they're telling him about it. So let me read here, John 20:24. But Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Now, think about this, what Thomas has done. He has rejected the eyewitness testimony of the others for 8 days. Strong testimony. We said 2 or 3 witnesses. We've got, minus Judas Iscariot, we've got 10 at least there who saw Jesus. And so Jesus appears there in verse 26 to them, "Peace be to you." And he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands. Reach your hand here and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to them, "My Lord and my God." It took him longer to come to believe in that instance than Nathanael in the first one. They were both skeptical at first. They believed after the evidence, most certainly. But it took just one or two small things for Nathanael, and Thomas rejected all of that testimony and rebuked for it. In verse 29, Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And in that last part of verse 29, he's describing us. Jesus' resurrection happened at a point in history, and that was over 2,000 years ago. He's not going to reenact the resurrection for us today. But we have, guess what? Eyewitness testimony. And we can believe based on that. We're expected to believe based on that. And blessed are we when we do. And so, just continuing the chart here, somebody who's hard to become a believer. Now, when we teach people, and we're teaching them truth about the gospel and how to come to God and salvation, don't people sometimes take more time than others to get to the point of faith? Sometimes something's in the way there. But in the case of this is really not an issue because the evidence is abundant. There's so much there. There's so much there. And frankly, if a person honestly examines all the evidence that's before us and still is unbeliever, they chose that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But jurors in a criminal case fall in the middle, somewhere between these two, usually. And and we fall in there too as well when we first view the evidence. So, finishing the first part of this lesson, we have the obligation to receive the evidence and examine it properly. And now, talking about to react to it properly. And there are only two reactions possible. If the evidence is strong, there's only one reaction that is appropriate. The other is not. In review, this is the chart that we saw yesterday, the process of evidence. That in a courtroom setting, evidence is presented as proof, establishes something is true. This is our response to it. We use reason, we believe that, and as a juror, we state that as a fact. We come to a verdict. And likewise, we ended the lesson that at that point, we are obligated to engage your will and to act accordingly. And so this is the first reaction, the only appropriate reaction when the evidence is clear and sufficient. But yet, as we mentioned just a moment ago, there's that other reaction where people disregard reason, they don't want to think it through, and instead they want to deny truth. You see, the first reaction is the only one that's rational. The second one, there's something interfering there in the process. And often, people say, well, if the evidence is so strong and so good for the Bible and God and Jesus Christ, why isn't everyone a believer? Well, many people aren't evidence motivated. and they want to keep their prejudices and biases. And if you're a juror, that would instantly disqualify you. Be on a juror. You couldn't do it. Let's look at the Bible and look at examples as far as why people don't believe, for instance, Jesus. And we learned that the first point, some people are more interested in validating what they already know or want than in finding the truth. Let's go to these Bible passages here. John chapter 5, beginning. John 5. John 5 and in verse 9, this is Jesus healing the lame man there at the pool of Bethesda. He says, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." John 5, verse 9, and immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. That day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He made me well, and he said to me, take up your bed and walk." You can go out, Jesus. Then they asked him, Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, the multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus had already shown that he was able to perform miracles. They didn't deny the miracles took place. They should have reasoned that this man is who he claims to be. We needed to examine the evidence. But you see, they didn't want to know the truth about it. They instead wanted to believe that he's a breaker of the Sabbath. So therefore we need to not. Of course, they're wrong about that. But here, they're just wanting to validate what they already knew instead of examining the truth. Go to John chapter 9. John 9 and verse 14. Here's the blind man who is made well by Christ. John 9 verse 14. It's the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. The Pharisees also asked him again how he received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay on my eyes and washed and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such a sign? There's a division among them. See, only a certain group of people are using reason. How could a man who's a sinner do a miracle? God is with the person who does a miracle. God is a problem. And so again, the Jews are like, we don't want to believe in this, and we want to keep our traditions. We don't want to change that at all. And when we talk to people about the truth, many times they're so stuck to their tradition and so stuck to their view, they're not going to consider anything else. And the Jews wanted to stick to their own preconceptions about the Messiah rather than see what he's actually like. And people do that often too. For instance, if somebody goes to the doctor and the doctor gives them bad news, if they have a terminal illness or something, they might respond, well, you're not my doctor. So some people, when faced with the truth, will be resistant and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not listening. Bad enough. I think we can see by example that some people are more interested in things of this world than finding the truth. You know, in John chapter 6, you have Jesus feeding the 5,000. And in John 6, in verse 15, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. And they were so happy that Jesus had provided all this food. Let's make him king! And they want to make him a physical king. And that's not what he came to be. So he left them. And so when he came to them again, Jesus says in verse 26, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the sign, not because you considered the evidence, but because you ate of the loaf in your field. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life. The Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has sent this on him. So what were these people more interested in? Food, filling their belly. People today are more interested in material things, physical desires. In the case of the religious Jews, they wanted power and prestige, which when we go to John chapter 11, for instance, in verses 47 and 48, you know, here the chief priests and the scribes are up in arms. You know, what shall we do? For this man performs many signs. You know, if we don't do anything, then, you know, everyone's going to believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. We'll lose our spot. We'll lose, you know, our position, our power, our influence over the people. And you see, they're more interested in the things of this world. Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3 that there will be mockers who come, walking according to their own lusts. They'll mock the truth because they are so lustful. They don't give that up. Some people don't believe because they're more interested in looking for something they think is sensational than in finding the truth. For example, in Luke chapter 23, Luke 23 and verse 8, this is Jesus when he was arrested. He's handed over to Pontius Pilate, who sends him over to Herod. Luke chapter 23 and verse 8, Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. He desired for a long time to see him, because he'd heard many things about him and hoped to see some miracle done by him. Now, Herod wasn't excited to see Jesus because, I've heard you're the Son of God and you do all these things, and this is neat, and I want to come to believe. He's wanting Jesus to put on a show. He wants something sensational. Do something. Which Jesus refused to do for him. And people, many times today, are looking for something sensational. Signs to their liking. There are sensational doctrines that the people many times believe in. For instance, premillennialism, where people look for signs of the end of time and all this is going to happen, when that's not based on Scripture at all. Look for the truth. Settle on that. Don't look for something that has wow factor. And I think the truth has wow factor enough. You don't need to invent anything else. Fourthly, some people fear the reality of truth at the cost of it. And thus they avoid it. And you can take, for instance, the blind man's parents who refused to say anything about Jesus, that he was the one who did it. So, ask him, ask our son, he will tell you. And because they were afraid that if they confessed Christ or said anything positive about it, they'd be kicked out of the synagogue. And that had a lot of consequence there in the Jewish community. They were afraid of that. And people fear social rejection if they obey the gospel, or they don't want to come to faith. Many people just fear change. People don't like change. And if there is a Savior, they're going to have to make some changes. They don't want that. Many people fear the concept of an almighty God, and you're accountable. No. We need to face the truth. Because simply disbelieving it doesn't mean it won't happen, the judgment won't happen. Now, in regard to these are not reasonable reactions, they are emotional reactions. That's what these are. And people put a lot of effort into trying to discredit God and the Bible and Jesus Christ, and they turn these emotions into a philosophy and psychology, and have these intellectual doctrines and things like that. And it's still just an emotional reaction, apart from the truth. So, when you consider unbelief, when the evidence is sufficient and clear, unbelief is a choice. A person chooses to lie, according to the 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And there are people who choose to ignore the glory of God in Romans chapter 1. And so this is not the correct choice. Not the correct choice at all. Right, going on from here, taking this part of our chart, understanding that to believe means we need to act accordingly. All right, let's, for the remainder of the lesson, see the three ways in which we need to act in regard to the evidence about the spiritual things. And in this, we see that our first action is to defend what we believe as fact. So we're going to use some statues here to kind of symbolize these actions. And so, you may have heard the word apology used in the sense of evidence. It comes from the word apologia in Greek. We're not talking about apologizing for something that you've done wrong. The word means a verbal defense, a speech in defense. And so, many times you hear in classical literature somebody giving their apology with a defense of the truth. And that's what we're commanded to do in Scripture, to give a defense. And the jurors are to act upon the guilt or innocence of the accused, render that verdict that we talked about. For Christians, there are obligations attached to understanding the truth, and we have to give a defense. And some people may ask, why do you believe what you believe? And you don't say, like we said in the first lesson, well, I just feel it in my heart. That's not evidence. You're not going to convince anybody of that. You have to give proof, valid reasons, evidence that's true. Back up what you believe. And so, looking at the verses that are mentioned there, the word defense is that word apologia. There in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and always be ready to give his defense. That everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and purity. And the underlined words there, defense, is the same word, apologia, Paul uses in those three contexts, talking about the defense and confirmation of the gospel. He's appointed for the defense of the gospel. He gives a defense before the Jewish mob in Acts chapter 22. We have to do that as well. Defend the facts. The second reaction is we need to promote the truth as fact. Promote it. And this means going on the offense. We don't just wait for people's objections and challenges to talk with them. We take the gospel to them to start with. And as Jude said, in verse 3, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. The word contend in Greek refers to an Olympic contest. It means to fight for something, strive for something in the field. Contend for the faith. Promote it. Go on the offense. Also, 2 Corinthians 10 also talks about our weapons of our warfare are not carnal, not physical. We use the word of God. It's mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Again, you can see you go on the offense in that too. And the early Christians knew what they believed, and they were not ashamed. They were not ashamed of it. They went everywhere preaching the word. That's what we have to do. Paul, as his custom was, went into them. He went to the Jews and reasoned with them. And then Jesus said in the Great Commission, Matthew 28, verse 19, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go, make disciples. We have to promote what is true as fact. And our last point is we've got to live in this fact. It's not enough to defend it or promote it. We have to be consistent with what we're teaching. It does no good if we live like the heathen, though we're trying to preach Jesus. That's absurd. That is absurd. So we're told, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. Because those outside the faith are looking at us and our lives, examining us. So we need to walk in wisdom, redeeming the time. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. You may know how you ought to answer each one. It is important how we answer people. We don't want to answer them with a bad attitude. We want to be loving, kind, gentle, but never backing off of the truth. Our character has to reflect the message that we're presenting. We talk about the context of 2 Timothy chapter 2. Because of time, I can't really go into this much. But again, we do what we do because we want them to know the truth. And when you look at that particular chapter, there's so much on personal character that's associated with teaching. And likewise, there's the context of 1 Peter chapter 3. We talked about giving the answer before, based on verse 15. Well, it's that they may be ashamed of their conduct. When people see how wicked they are, and even though they mistreat us, if we still treat them with respect and dignity, that might cause shame in them having a desire to repent. How is our character? How do we live? What type of words do we choose? Are we consistent with what we're teaching others? When you consider these three actions that come from faith, Jesus did all three of these and expected it and encouraged it in others. Are you, as a Christian, living up to what Christ expects of you? The truth about Him is too valuable to keep to ourselves. If you're not a Christian, this is the last charge. What is your obligation to evidence? Well, you need to receive and examine it properly. As Luke in Acts talks about those in Berea who receive the word with all readiness. That's the juror who has open mind. That's what we need to do with the evidence. And then we need to react to it appropriately. And that means as quickly as possible. Because a juror, when he comes to the decision, guilty or not guilty, doesn't say, well, we know what's true, but we want to deliberate a lot longer. Can we stay a few more days in here? That's absurd. And it's just as absurd when we know the truth and we delay acting upon it. Saul of Tarsus was told by Ananias, now why are you waiting? You know who Jesus is. You saw him on the way to Damascus. And Saul of Tarsus was asking, he was sorry for what he had done in denying Christ and persecuting Christians. Why are you waiting? Why are you waiting? Rise and be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. That's what we call on you to do. If you're ready, come. Come, we stand and sing.